Kenny joined the RSA in 2007, I believe, and he currently is one of the most eminent sculptors that we have. He makes the most incredible classical but very contemporary figurative sculptures, which have, for me, an amazing stillness and power and are perhaps deceptively simple. I'm sure many of you do not need to be introduced to his work, but for those of you who don't realize that his fireman, his sculpture outside Central Station is one of the most iconic pieces of work in Scotland. Kenny trained at Glasgow School of Art, but is from Edinburgh and now comes back and is living in Edinburgh. And he also trained in Rome and in Athens. Is that right, Kenny?
Yes.
Fantastic. Anyway, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Kenny. And if, as Elena said, if anyone has any questions at the end, that would be great. And if you want to just type in any as you go along on the chat screen, Elena will be monitoring those questions as well. Okay, let's go. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone out there in the digital world. Welcome to my studio. I'm Kenny Hunter. I'm very fortunate to have a studio inside a foundry, inside a working fine art foundry. And it's been my base for the last 5 years. As Kate mentioned, personally in Glasgow, and had a studio in an old sweetie factory in Anniesland. So what we're proposing to do with the time we've got is to maybe just go through sort of technical processes and examples of work, talk about materials, and also talk about sort of live projects. So in a way, you're getting an insight into work. But a lot of the things I'm going to show you are actually works in progress. So that's quite an unusual thing for most art viewers or people who attend galleries. You always see the thing where the artist is obviously kind of signed off as a finished thing. Most of the stuff I'm showing you now is partial, is unresolved, is in flux. So, and I'm also going to take you a little tour of the foundry as well, so you get a sense of the process, how things are translated from clay, squishy mud, which I love so much, into metal. So without further ado, I mean, I've arranged some objects on the table behind me. I can talk you through them. I mean, this rabbit would seem like an obvious thing to point to. This is you can see two halves of the mold here. So every artist that arrives at powderable bronze to get something converted into metal starts with this. A mold has to be made. And this inner sleeve here is silicone rubber, and it's painted on like liquid, and it solidifies with a catalyst in it. And this hard shell plaster is put around it as well, so it becomes rigid and not a big floppy useless piece of rubber. On top of that, you can produce multiples, which is one of the big factors about being a sculptor who uses casting. Is this idea of multiplicity. It can lead to all sorts of creative things, as well as additioning works as well, obviously. This horrific object is an anatomical man. Not something, it's not my work, it's something I bought off the internet, but it's a kind of, I just thought I'd show you because it's the kind of thing I need to do to make my work believable. I'm not a slave to anatomy. I don't spend days rendering every single vein on somebody's forehead or sinew. But I like the work to be convincing. I don't want it to jar. I don't want it to come together right or it's not standing. Most of all, I want my work to have gravity. I want it to stand, look like it's got purpose and it has presence. So I want people to get past the anatomy and get into the actual content in terms of its energy, in terms of its intention. So once I have this in my studio, I'm modeling in clay. I might then start with something like this, which is like a little kind of wire man figure with some support around the back of it, and I would model clay straight onto that as a way to start the initial idea. And clay for me is almost the kind of the best part of it. It's the most direct creative thing. You're actually working with your fingers directly. There's no tool really to speak of at the start. It feels kind of pretty primal and direct way of being creative. And then the creativity sort of, as you go through different processes, there's still creative decisions to make, but it becomes more technical and arguably less fun as well. I'd like to draw your attention to this object here. This is a model for a sculpture I did in London called the IGO. And this studio you're in now is a good example of the kind of work I do. I do models for bigger projects in this little studio, and I can work up to the scale of a human being. Anything beyond that, I go down into the foundry to work on bigger objects and also get hands-on as well. That's the other thing. Sculpture is a real social art form, so we tend to benefit as sculptors from being around other creatives and other technical people. And so I'm very lucky that way, really, to be here. I've got that covered. I'm going to now show you. You're going to have to experience a little bit of turbulence now, because I'm going to pick up the camera. I'm walking around the studio and then walking around the foundry. So I'll try and keep the camera still as I can.
It's okay. It makes it more realistic, Kenny. It's great.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
You don't want to see this. You want to see. Okay. How do I do this again?
That's it.
Yeah, that's better. Right. So you can see this little figure here. This is a figure I'm working on for a client in China. It's kind of to do with science. It's not quite resolved yet. I'm planning quite a few changes. But again, that's in a similar scale to the one before. This thing, however, is this is one I'm doing for Shetland. I've always fancied doing a sculpture with a hole. I've always felt holes in sculpture have kind of been a kind of what you call it, a standard. You know, especially in a kind of modern era, the pierced form of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, that type of thing. So I've always been interested in trying to incorporate a sculpture that was all about the void as well as the form. And in this case, this is, if I turn it around, this is, as I say, a work in progress. It's not really finished. You're going to get a general idea. On the bottom of the part of the sculpture, you can see a seabed. So you can see a crab there with a plant on the right-hand side. It's called Dead Man's Fingers. And a couple of boulders. On the other side, we have some, what do you call them, limpets, I guess, and an octopus. And the pipe above it is the gas pipeline, which comes from the Sillenville gas terminal and brings the gas on shore, which we all burn in our kitchens. And I found the whole thing quite mind-blowing, actually, that there's basically a direct line to a cavity under the sea, taking this invisible product along a pipe and literally into your kitchen, with no real, there are kind of stops obviously along the way, but it's basically fed out of that hole as opposed to stored in big jars and then put into homes, if you know what I mean. It is actually part of one hugely complicated engineering project. So the idea is that this will all be in bronze, and in fact I'll be able to show you it in bronze later on the tour. And this pipe will be fabricated to a much higher standard than you can currently see it now. But that will all be one piece of bronze. And then below the plinth that this thing will sit on, it will have a cavity in it as well, a hole going through it, but a hole going in the opposite direction. So both these holes, one indicates the gas pocket under the ocean floor, and the hole in the pipe obviously is the pipeline. And when it's installed in Shetland, it'll be on the coast, one of the coast roads in Lerwick, and you'll be able to then frame the sea. So you look through the pipe and you'll see the sea and the boats going out to the fishing, pelagic fishing fleet on their way out to catch fish for us all to eat. Okay, so I'm going to give you another quick scan of the studio. That's my portrait of Churchill with his Tommy gun. Probably the last British Prime Minister to be photographed holding a firearm and smoking a fag, or a cigar in his case. Some other little bits and pieces. You can see here a toy octopus. That's my model. You can see these little posable figures I use for scale. This is me working on a little model with the rabbits, turntables, all the crap they're doing. There's a bit more anatomy here. We have a anatomical skeleton and poster from a show at ESW. So we're going to head downstairs now, folks. This would be a bad time for me to take a tumble, wouldn't it? Because I end up on YouTube if I fell down these stairs. Okay, I'll show you some more of my own work for this Haddington job. So the thing I'm doing for Haddington is basically 3 animal studies that indicate a kind of deeper history of relationships with animals with the people of East Lothian. This first one here, we see the dog is a sighthound, a greyhound, and they were very common, or lurchers, so very popular with miners. And there used to be quite a lot of coal mining in East Lothian, especially where I was brought up in Musselburgh. And they were often used to get a rabbit for the pot in hard times, even right up to the time of the miners' strike in '84. So he sits there, he's going to sit on that's him in resin, but he's going to be a bronze, and he's going to be sitting outside the hospital as if he's waiting on somebody coming out. Again, with reference to the pit ponies, there's this little pony, stocky little pony, with his tail missing currently. But these ponies, these Dartmoor or ponies, were used underground as well, and had their manes cut short. They got all clarty with coal dust. And you can see at the back there, it's resin to bronze. So I go through a stage of clay, and I cast into resin, and then that resin's then converted into bronze. So we have these. This is how although I'm modeling clay, once I get the resin, I'm actually sanding and filing the resin. So I'm actually sculpting, because the definition of sculpting is to remove material. Actually, modeling in clay is basically adding material. It's not quite the same thing. You get the general idea. Okay, so let me give you a quick look around the studio. You'll see lots of other interesting pieces of materials and half-finished sculptures around the place. That's because it's there's lots of different jobs, lots of different artists' work comes through this foundry. I'm not supposed to film anything that's not mine, though. I'll try my best to not do that. But this is basically the fabrication space. So anything that the foundry are helping an artist to scale up can occupy that big light pad there. They can build quite huge, really, things up to maybe the ceiling's probably about 3-4 meters at the apex. Got a classroom through there. So we're going to head to the wax shop first, and the wax shop is where most artists pitch up first to get rubber molds where they're made. The molds taken off the sculpture, and we can see some plaster, we can see buckets of wax. Let me take you to something. So here's a form that's basically had a wing form, and they've painted rubber on it. You can see it's quite thin. I got quite close to that. It'll help you see the runny texture. And you can also still see the clay or the wax through the rubber. So the technicians here build up that thick rubber coat till you get something more like this. You can see there's a human figure under there, but the rubber is now much thicker and much smoother. Once this is now ready to receive its hard shell plaster jacket, a bit like that one. So what happens once you've got that rubber mold is you then need to create a wax. And the wax is then invested in the lost wax found method. I'm going to pull something out of the water tank and hopefully not drop it into the water tank. Okay. I'm going to put this down here. You can see this. This is a piece of, I think it's a piece of furniture. It's been cast into bronze. It's a leg of a chair. But what I'm drawing your attention to is this thing here is a runner riser system. So this, what you've got to imagine is this piece of wax becomes a negative, becomes a void, becomes space. And this is the cavity where the bronze will run down these down here and then fill up that mold. It's all encased. Okay, I'll put that back in the tank later. So, and then once you have that wax run up, it then goes into a thing called a refractory mold, something like this. So that the wax is then encased in this grog mix, which is sand and plaster and brick dust, and then the whole thing is then baked in a huge kiln, which drives out all the moisture and to stop any explosions, and then also melts out the wax to leave the cavity for the bronze to go in. Okay, well, I'll show you some more examples which will hopefully really confirm or illustrate better the process we're involved in. Now that piece I showed you just there is related to this. You can see, first of all, this is a pouring cup. So this is where the bronze would have gone down these channels here, the molten bronze would have gone down these channels here, and then filled back up again. This stuff is called flashing. It's where the bronze has managed to find a way through little cracks. Here you can see my crab in bronze. It's just straight out of the mold. You can see how much work is still to be done on the casting by the technicians, welding and nail holes and getting rid of flashing and just generally tidying it up. Okay, sorry for that humming. That's and here's where the bronze pit is. So if I can point, you see that thing there? That's the crucible where the bronze is melted, then poured into that pot there, which is brought over, by hand, and then poured into these molds. This is all just cooling down. I can still feel the heat off this. So all these molds have got bronze castings inside them, and the sand is around them to stop any, if a mold cracks and molten metal spills out, that's obviously a bad thing. So it's a safety measure that they're all encased in sand as well. We'll take you a little bit closer to see that crucible set up. I can also show you raw bronze, which is how it comes into the foundry. It comes in like this. And as a wee treat, I'm showing you this, which has just arrived today. That's the elephant in the room. It belongs to me. It's just come back from the Calder Valley. And it's going to form part of a show I'm going to do in Aberdeen in 2021. It's really great to be reunited. This was a sculpture I built in 2014 during the Commonwealth Games in Bellahouston Park, and is a kind of sculpture which addresses memory and empire and the transition into Commonwealth, and this idea that well, the actual sculpture which now sits in Bellahouston Park is made of iron, but it's not. The iron itself was sourced from Glasgow-built locomotives, which were melted down and recast in the form of the elephant. So it's a meditation on time and history, and also the changeable nature of it, of both. But it's quite a thing to be reunited with it again. I absolutely love this piece. It bears lots of scars now of its manufacture. and that for me adds quite a lot of interesting history to it. That was a real team effort to build this. There was about 4 or 5 of us on this job. Okay, so again, that's some of my rabbits there. I mentioned that that's for the Harrington job for the hospital. There's 3 of them. That's in bronze, unpatinated bronze. This is a typical metalworking bay. So once the sculpture's been cast, as you saw, and fettled, it's brought back into this area where all the repairing and welding together of sections happens. So these are all different bays for different workers to do their work. They're working with all sorts of power tools, burrs, flat wheels, welding, hand files, all that type of thing. And there's my dog, fading away in bronze underneath the shelf. Okay, that's the Powder Hall Bronze Foundry for you. This building was part of a warehouse at one time, I think, and the trains would actually come back right into the warehouse one time and offload their goods through that door just right ahead there. That big door there is where the train would come in. So it's a part of Edinburgh's industrial heritage, I guess, and still is if you think about it. That concludes the tour, folks. I'll go back upstairs now and maybe, Kate, could you maybe ask me a question or two or something? Would that be a good time to ask you a question?
I would be delighted, Kenny. I've been trying not to interrupt you. I didn't want to interrupt your flow straight away.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I would appreciate your input now.
Okay. Kenny, can we start with the most recent thing first? Tell me more about this elephant. Is that the actual elephant that was in the Commonwealth Games that's been delivered, or is that a new version of it?
Okay, so what I would typically do, I built the sculpture in clay, and then the sculptures then we take a plaster waste mold off that, and there's maybe about 25 sections, big sections coming off that. They were then laid up in a material called glass reinforced plastic, which is tough but light.
Right.
And then I could then sand and file that, add filler, and really kind of work the surface up where I wanted. And then normally that would be enough if it was going to bronze if you're just making a rubber mold of that form. Because this was getting turned into iron, it's an industrial process. It went down to a foundry called Weir Pumps, which is a Scottish firm, but their biggest plant is in the Calder Valley in Yorkshire.
Wow.
And they did this amazing job of casting it into iron. And I think it weighed over 10 tons. I mean, the crucible was absolutely enormous. They poured it all in one go. There's no, like, you didn't have to weld it together in sections.
How extraordinary.
This is like it looks like some futuristic foundry. It's so big. And so basically, in order to do that, they needed to cut my sculpture in half. They cut me off in half to create this cavity in the center, and then those holes that you saw.
Yeah.
Then the side, that was where iron rods went through the sculpture and held that core in suspension, so they could suspend a core in there, so the metal would pour around it, and then just so there wasn't so much weight in it.
But this one that we're seeing here has just been created and delivered. Is that right?
No. That was created in 2014.
All right, this is the one that was created. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That's basically the one I had my hand on in a way. If you think about metal casting, the artist, in terms of me, I model the clay and then I cast the resin and I work the resin. But then the metal workers come in and translate it into metal.
Yeah.
So in a way, that resin one is the kind of artist copy, if you
Yeah.
like. And it's kind of funny, because like the whole discussion in art about the original is really a conversation that painting's been having with itself forever, whereas sculpture has always been has always had this ability to copy. It's not a new thing; it's an ancient thing, So
I know I'm
and
always by that thing about an addition of bronzes and
yeah,
and I think it's wonderful. And as a printmaker, I can totally get that, because they are all art. I mean, they're all works of art, but they
yeah,
are multiples as well. I mean,
yeah. And I think in a way there's an aura around the original, isn't there? And it's kind of built up through art criticism and salesmanship, I guess, as well, to push the price up of things.
yeah.
Whereas if you have an edition, it makes it a much more democratic, more kind of. What I'm trying to say is, I think we should lift up the artist's vision as the most important thing, not the fact it's an exclusive one-off.
You're here, yeah. I'm fascinated by the fact that I think you are very much 21st century artist, but I love the fact that you're working in a medium which has this extraordinary tradition. I mean, how far back does the art of casting in bronze go? It's very old, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously the 5th century BC in Greece. It was done. I think it goes back to older times, maybe
China, I think, even.
China, yeah, Babylonia, Syria, India have
Yeah.
their own traditions in bronze casting and metalworking. And then I think during the Dark Ages it kind of went out. People forgot how to do it, I think, for a bit. And I think, is that right?
I don't
God,
know.
I don't have I'm not the authority on it, but
No, I just think it's the most exciting thing to see.
mm,
It's wonderful you sharing this actual
yeah,
environment with us, and I know it's always so busy, and I know it will be again. So in a way, we're
yeah,
lucky to be able to wander around with you and look at
yeah.
all the processes. And it's
Sorry,
such hands-on.
sorry, yeah. It still is hands-on, but I'm also aware that I want to adapt the digital into the process as well, if I can, if it's appropriate. I mean, for me, I don't know about you, Kate, but I feel that the digital age has got. I don't like falling on one side or the other of the camp and just throwing everything at one or the other. For me, it's the most interesting work generally happens where there's kind of hybridity, where there's a mixing of the digital and the handmade, can often result in quite exciting
Um,
things. I often find the digital's kind of errors and flaws and glitches are the most interesting thing about it.
sure.
Because when you actually see the product, it's quite cold sometimes. It's quite a certainly for 3D printing. I mean, everybody talked about the impact of photography on painting. In a way, sculpture is experiencing that right now. We can now just get a scanner, scan a person, and then print them out in foam, and it's an exact copy of them. So you then got to say, well, what is it about the handmade sculpture that makes it of value? What can artists bring to that process that the machine can't? And that, I think, was something that people were talking about in painting 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think as you said when we were talking earlier, Kenny, that about artists' adaptability, and I think that's an example of it. That we
Yeah,
take something and we just bring it in and adapt it to our use, and
yeah,
I think that the digitization, I mean, the digital revolution has changed art all over in the way that photography did earlier. But it's an assimilation rather than either or, isn't it?
yeah. I think so, absolutely. I think you've got to be true to your school, in a way, but you've also got to be open to the future and adapt. Otherwise, you know, you get lost in some golden age,
Yeah.
nostalgia, which isn't healthy. I think there never was a golden age. So let's be honest. What's exciting is what's new generally. So you adapt to it and you bring it in, and you see in that kind of mixing up something good can come out of it.
Yeah. I have a question about another piece that you showed us, the pipeline piece, which is
Yeah,
really interesting. And I love the idea that it's going to have a pipe going this way and another hole, another pierced form going in the opposite way underneath. And
yeah.
you say what the actual final scale is going to be of that work. Is it the scale that we saw, or?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so effectively, the average human height, I guess it must be something like 5'8" or something, 5'6". You know, it's going to have like it's going to be that height. So the hole
Look through
in
it.
the gas pipeline will literally frame your head. So it should be accessible in that sense. And you know, with public art, it's very much the site informs the work. You know, it's half the work, isn't it? I mean, that sculpture wouldn't make sense if I put it in Devon or something. You know, I mean, Shetland really blew me away. It was such a it felt like a frontier town, you know, Lerwick. You know,
Yeah.
it had all these kind of crazy fishermen and oil riggers coming off boats, and there was this money to be made, and there was, you know, there was money out there, but it was a rough way to make your living, a tough environment to make a living.
Yeah.
And you had a local community that wasn't particularly shaped around tourism, you know, in the way that some other parts of rural Scotland, it's very much the main economy. Whereas Shetland's sort of, oh yeah, it gets a few tourists, but it's big bucks are in the fishing to this day. So
Place, isn't it?
sorry.
Very practical place, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I only had a very brief visit, but you have to be. I guess you have to be practical. The weather's so extreme. You know, you got to get your priorities right, haven't you?
I can just see the wind whistling through that pipe, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh-huh. It's I can see also it. I'm very interested when you said it's about 5'8" and it's about human scale, because that's something I'd like to go back to with your works. You're very much about that human scale, and I remember you saying earlier that you like to take a lot of things off of plinths and onto street level for people, and
yeah.
it's, although there's no people in this work, you're still very much thinking about the person towards the sculpture and becoming involved in it, which I think is lovely.
Yeah, I think the thing about sculpture is it's this idea of presence. You know, that you measure yourself against the object. It sits in a real space with you. Painting and photography asks you to suspend disbelief and treat the picture plane as a view into another reality. Whereas the sculpture sits in the same space as you. You walk around it, especially if it's a human, you know, on the ground.
Yeah.
There's a kind of almost an inner life to it in a way. If it's done right, done well, there's a kind of
I absolutely.
a presence to it, yeah. But I mean, I love plinths as well. I mean, plinths have been a kind of, well, how can I say this? They're like the kind of the most uncool thing for years in sculpture. Everything had to go on the floor. You know, if you brought a plinth in, it was like, oh, don't bring, you know, that's too old school. But I actually think the plinth is a real opportunity to extend and develop narrative. And I've always used the plinth as a way to do that. See it as an opportunity, not just as a device to get the thing up to the correct viewing height.
Yeah.
What can you do with it? You know, you can bring in different material values. You can talk about structures of power, and that's I mean, that's the whole plinth thing was about. That wasn't it? Wasn't just a practical thing to keep vandals off. There was also this sense of
Down on people.
hierarchy, yeah, and elevation, and of course the big in sculptural history, the big pivot point was Rodin's Burghers of Calais, when he took the figures off the plinth and onto the ground and expected the audience to relate to the figures as with empathy rather than reverence. That was a key moment in sculpture, but that's well over 100 years ago.
Gosh.
So the idea of sculpture on the floor isn't radical anymore, I'm afraid.
It was just, I know it's not, but I think it's just that way that I think your work is seen with a huge amount of affection, and I can totally get that sense with the animals that you've got for it's a new community hospital, isn't it, Kenny? The
That's
one in,
correct.
yeah. So that place of inviting people in, and it's going to be a community hub for all sorts of different, looking at people's health. And I think that the animals, they might end up getting a lot of patting, like great
Yeah.
hobby, those.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that's great.
I think the animal form is kind of compelling, because first of all, they don't date like humans. We tend to sort of look at humans, images of humans, we can date them by their haircuts and their clothing and their glasses. Animals just are, timeless in that sense. They're also unknowable. There's a mystery about animals. What do they think? How conscious are they? How sentient are they? And I guess we probably think we're beginning to understand how sentient they are. And we're starting to review our morality towards animals and relationship to animals all the time. But so on one level, I'm interested in animal consciousness, but I'm also interested in them as symbols for bigger issues around society.
And we'll be back with the next feature will be Anne Bevan a week today in her studio in Orkney, and I think Anne is here somewhere, but I'm not sure if we can. Oh look, I just put up all the pictures of everybody, and there's a great crew. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next week, maybe.